Well, welcome. This is. Thank you. So, welcome on this seminar organized. Organized by us, but basically having here IGC presenting some work. The intention is to have a bit more regularly people from the International Growth Center to come in and present some of the work, putting things, current research a bit in context of what's going on in the research world. I want to also make a little point on the taxation side of it. This is an area that many of us all know that, many of us know that we're pushing this something as an area where DFID is being more involved in, and it has become so also in collaboration with HMRC and a lot of work in particular countries. What we would like to do is not just focusing on collection, but also on issues to do with, how do we think about tax in development, tax policy, and other related issues. And so this is also the first one of a few seminars we'll have over coming months that actually will try to talk about taxation and some of the other things. I can just as well as announce there will be at some point Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies will also come and talk a little bit about tax policy evaluation and possible things that we could do more in developing countries as well in a very applied sense. Anyway, but Jonathan, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefan. I'm Jonathan Lee, the Executive Director of the International Growth Center. And just to say, briefly, we're very pleased to see these seminars going ahead. We had the first one, as you may know, about a month ago with Rachel Bannister talking about the economic impact of the Ebola crisis. And we're very pleased that Henrik agreed to give this second one on tax in developing countries. It's been a huge area for us, and I think an area that we've been very excited about in the sense that it really represents what the IGC is all about, which is trying to bring together new frontier research, and a number of articles have already come out of this program that are really having quite a broad influence on thinking about tax within the academic profession, as well as having a really direct impact on policy. So Henrik will give you some examples, but we've had a very direct impact in Pakistan. I was just on a conference call this morning with Bangladesh, and the policy there on tax morale is having an impact that's being incorporated into their policy now. So it really is an area where there seems great scope for bringing together these innovations in theory and in empirical work that Henrik's going to talk about, and improvements in policy.
Thank you. Are the slides going to come up there? Okay, they're about to. Okay, so thanks for having me. I'm Henrik Kleven. There we go. So I'm I'm co-director at the IGC of the State Capabilities Program, which is the pillar within the IGC where we are thinking, among other things, about tax. So I'm going to. I don't know if I'm completely open to taking questions along the way, or we could do it at the very end. I'll leave that to you. I'm just in academia we're used to people interrupting and being rude and saying whatever they want whenever they feel like it. So I'm flexible. Yes.
And in that vein, just to say that there's us here in the room, but also you might not have noticed Henrik behind you.
Yes,
there's people from from headquarters in Scotland and from 3 different African offices from Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Kinshasa.
Okay.
So I'm sure there'll be questions from there also later.
All right, thank you. Okay, so let me see if this is that works. And I can see it over there. Okay, so I'm going to start out with a very basic empirical plot that looks similar to something I'm sure you've seen many times before, namely plotting the tax to GDP ratio in different countries against GDP per capita. And when you plot that across countries, you see this very well-known positive relationship between tax take and income. So essentially, developing countries tend to have a tax to GDP ratio of around 10%, and of course they have a fairly low GDP capita, and developed countries have a tax take of typically 40 to 50% and a much higher GDP capita. So in very broad terms, what we would like to do in development economics,
and specifically in the IDC, is to think about how do countries go from being in the lower left corner of a graph like this and the upper right corner. But of course, that's not a very easy question to answer. In thinking about that question, you can think about two broad approaches. This is at least how I have sort of taxonomy that I've chosen here. One is sort of what I've called a big picture macro approach, which is to really think about what is it that shapes tax collection, tax capacity in the very long run. Basically, what are the factors that make countries go from having a tax take of 10% to having a tax take of 40 or 50%? That's a fascinating question, but it's also one that's extremely difficult to answer. Because as we just saw in the previous graph, a tax take of 40 to 50% goes hand in hand with a much higher GDP per capita, and it goes really hand in hand with all the other components of development that we would normally think about. So really answering that question or posing that question is really the same, or almost the same as posing the question, what makes a low-income country a high-income country? And we don't really have very conclusive answers to that question yet. So therefore, we're not going to take that approach in the IGC. We take instead what I call the nitty-gritty micro approach, which is a much more incremental approach. Basically, what that approach is doing, so one thing I can't see, or can I stand over here? Just sometimes it's nice to see your slides, and I should have gone through this like 5 years ago, but I'm refusing, so I don't see so well. So what that approach does instead is to ask the question, given tax capacity this week, what can we do to incrementally improve tax capacity through various policy measures, improving various dimensions of tax administration. So basically, this approach is to try and ask what can we do to incrementally improve tax administration, tax enforcement.
Themselves on each at *6, please. Thank you.
All right. So I've listed 4 topics here: tax administration, tax enforcement, tax policy, and tax morale. And these are the 4 dimensions in which we are typically thinking that we're typically thinking about at the IGC, and we're thinking about incremental improvements within areas like that. So we take the more nitty-gritty micro approach. So specifically how that works is that we would start from rather than starting from the very big picture and the very macro perspective, we start from a specific context and typically one concrete problem. And then we address problems one problem at a time. And then the idea is to implement empirically grounded research that helps us come up with some policy designs, and typically some incremental policy designs suited for the specific problem and the specific context. What is key about this is that it typically requires, it lends itself to and also often requires close collaborations between policymakers and researchers. And most of the work that goes on in the IGC is really based, I mean, that's kind of one of the key philosophies of the IGC, is to have these close collaborations between researchers and policymakers. So while that happens in all areas of the IGC, I think taxation is perhaps particularly well suited to this kind of approach, and maybe that explains some of the success we've been having in the tax area in the IGC. So, and there are a couple of reasons for that I've listed here. So one is that in order to do this, you need good data, and the thing is that in taxation we often have really excellent data because tax records represent really a fantastic source of administrative data. And in general, when I say we need good data, I think especially what we need, or what is particularly great, is when we have administrative data, because those data sets are much larger than survey data sets, and they tend to have much less measurement error than survey data sets, so we can do better research with those kinds of data. The second part is that in the tax policy arena, there's a lot of variation in incentives and in policies, because policymakers change policies all the time. So we have tax reforms, we have changes in tax enforcement, and we can use these policy changes to analyze policy impacts. And also, in taxation, very often have the policies are designed in certain ways that create, for example, discontinuities in incentives around certain parts of the income distribution or in other dimensions, and those are very useful for research. The desired outcomes are often measurable. I mean, one outcome which is clearly measurable is revenue collected, but obviously we want to go beyond just revenue collected and think about welfare and so on. But there, we have some approaches in this area that allows us to measure outcomes in a very good way. We also have a very well developed theoretical background and theoretical framework in public finance that can be brought to bear in designing the empirical work and in linking the empirical work ultimately to welfare analysis and analysis of policy implications. And finally, we have the advantage that policymakers in countries all around the world are extremely interested in taxation. They're a lot of policymakers in developing countries in particular are very concerned about the low tax takes and the low tax compliance in those countries. So there's a lot of scope for collaboration there. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to go through the 4 topics that I've listed and talk about specifically what are the questions and what have we been doing in IGC and how does that fit into this nitty-gritty micro approach. So the first topic is tax enforcement. So obviously the key components of tax enforcement are things such as tax audits, the penalties you impose. Those are sort of traditional enforcement parameters that we want to think about. Then the next things that are really important have to do with information. I mean, at the end of the day, in terms of what really makes a tax enforcement system successful, I've come to think over the years that is mainly about information. I mean, that is the single most important factor. So, for example, of course, as you know, in developed countries, we have very widespread systems of third-party information reporting and also tax withholding. And that's, I'm going to come back to this, but that's something that's been very important in the current high-income countries. And plus we have all sorts of other verifiable information trails. That is, even when we don't have explicit systems of third-party reporting, there's a lot of other information out there that tax enforcement agencies can use. Right? So an example is, of course, the whole expansion of credit cards. Well, that creates a lot of electronic trails, a lot of paper trails, and although they weren't designed for that purpose, it has a side effect on tax enforcement, because enforcement agencies can potentially use this. So I have a couple of papers with co-authors, such as Emmanuel Sais and Klaus Kreiner, that are saying that, sort of to a first approximation, these papers are saying that tax enforcement is basically successful if and only if verifiable third-party information covers most of the income that is generated. So that I think is I mean, that's an important conclusion, but it's also a conclusion that's going to make us a little bit depressed in this room, because third-party information reporting does not have wide coverage in low-income countries, and it's also not necessarily likely that it's going to that we're going to get a very wide coverage very soon. So this is going to lead to a fairly bleak picture of what we can do in developing countries. So where the starting point of the IGC is really absent wide coverage of these third-party information trails. What can we do? And there are really sort of 2 things. One is, can we expand information trails of third-party reporting, withholding, and so on? And what are the effects? And the second one is, if we can't do that, what should we do with 1 and 2, especially 1 and audits? Okay, so to make this a bit more precise, let me show you some evidence from a country which is the polar opposite of the countries that we are concerned with in the IGC, namely my native country, Denmark, which is the world record holder in tax take, and where you have an exceptionally good tax enforcement system. So this is evidence from a randomized control trial that we did in Denmark a few years ago, and what it shows is estimates from that RCT. So what I'm plotting here is the evasion rate against the fraction of income that is purely self-reported. So think of individuals. You can have income in 1 or 2 forms. You can have income from, say, your wage income here at DFID, and that's third-party reported by DFID directly to the directly to HMRC. And then you can also have income on the side, which is purely self-reported if you do some consulting in Africa, for example. And that's not third-party reported; it's purely self-reported. This plots the evasion rate against the fraction of your income that's self-reported. And the red one is the total evasion rate, and the black dashed one is the evasion rate specifically on the part of your income which is third-party reported. And what you can see is that throughout the distribution, the evasion rate on third-party reported income is zero, literally zero, which means that the total evasion rate here, which is increasing in self-reporting, really reflects the evasion on the part of your income which is purely self-reported.
So that's a question. This is about individuals or companies?
Okay, so this particular graph is about personal income taxation.
Okay, so Danish people are just basically pretty honest.
That is actually not the conclusion.
What about Danish companies?
But the conclusion is not the conclusion is the opposite. So in some sense, what motivated this paper was precisely the notion which is out there that, oh, Scandinavians are so honest, and we kind of wanted to, and I don't want to do it, I'm not happy about it, but I wanted to kind of kill that that conventional wisdom. What this one shows is that each individual is a perfect complier on the income that is third-party reported, and a big evader on the income which is self-reported. In other words, each individual is a cheat when they have the opportunity to be that, and when they're not, it's because they can't. That is in some sense the picture this is saying.
So the Danish are good corporate citizens?
No. They're not good citizens because they evade a lot when they can. You see, when a Dane is completely honest when they get income in a form where it will for sure be detected if they try to evade. But whenever they get a little bit of consulting income on the side, and there's no way the tax authorities can find out about it, then they evade pretty much all of it. So actually the way this graph is constructed is, so this here is the 45-degree line, and the way it's constructed here is if the red line is on the 45-degree line, it means that your evasion rate on your self-reported income is 100%. So basically down here at the bottom of the distribution you have an evasion rate of about 100%, and up here you have an evasion rate of about 50%. And the guys up here, those are the guys who have their income almost purely in self-reported form. And who are those individuals? That's basically the self-employed. The self-employed individuals have an evasion rate of about 50%. So what is interesting to think about is how should we think about this graph for Denmark in the developing country context? We want to think about two key differences between Denmark and those countries that we care about in the IGC. One is that in Denmark, there aren't that many self-employed individuals as in other advanced countries. And so in Denmark, most income is really third-party reported. So almost all of the mass of individuals in Denmark is going to be down here, which is why we have a very low evasion rate on average in Denmark, because almost everybody's down here where they have very little income that can be evaded. The difference between Denmark and the developing country is that there's a completely different firm structure and a completely different share of self-employed individuals, so most people are going to be up here. And if you did that in Denmark, you'd also have a very high evasion rate there. That's one difference.
That was really my question.
Okay, yeah.
So you've designed a structure that makes people declare their income.
Precisely.
But for wealthy people and the firms, they're a bit more difficult, a bit more slippery.
Well, let me come. I mean, I don't want to go.
It's about the nature of the employment.
Yeah, it's really about the nature of the employment. So the thing is, we also do this. We also look at heterogeneity by income. So wealthy individuals, they also have very low evasion because their income is also caught by the third-party information trail. It's not about income per se. These things can be correlated with income if it so happens that richer people have less of their income in a form that is a third-party reported. Like, for example, I think this is what you have in mind, wealthy people are putting money offshore and so on. But what this graph is showing is that the key driver is about information. That's what's driving. Let me give you the other difference between Denmark and say Pakistan or Kenya and so on, which is that the question you might ask is that, okay, so the self-employed individuals here have an evasion rate of 50%. But that actually sounds quite modest because they have income in a form where evasion basically can't be detected. So why aren't they evading 100%? Well, the thing is that in an advanced country, you have information trails that go beyond just a fraction that go beyond just explicit third-party reporting. That's what I was just talking about before with, say, credit cards and mortgage contracts and so on. So in advanced countries, there is so much information created, derivative information created in what you do. So even self-employed individuals, they can't remain 100%. It's going to be very conspicuous, and there will be information that can be, there will be a smoking gun that the tax authorities can go after. That's another difference from a lot of developing countries, is that those other information trails are not as well developed. So in developing countries, most countries are here, and probably that red line would be higher there. That's what I'm going at. One way of seeing this across countries, so if we look across countries, we have a simple proxy for how widespread third-party reporting is, which is basically the fraction of the population which is self-employed. As a first approximation, self-employed individuals have purely self-reported income, and wage earners tend to have third-party reported income. So that's not a bad proxy. And what you can see here is when you plot the tax take across countries against the fraction self-employed, there's a very clear downward slope there. So the countries we care about, as you see it down here, the Scandinavian countries, for example, up here, and the US is here, and the question for the IDC is kind of how do we move countries along this line? And obviously, the policy recommendation, it's not a naive policy recommendation would be to say to India, Pakistan, well, just, they do, look at Denmark, they do a good job, why don't you just implement their information reporting system? But that's not really going to work, because there are a lot of context-specific factors that are important here that are, so specifically, if you want to think, well, how can third-party reporting work? Well, it only works under one specific important assumption, namely that there is no collusion between the taxpayer and the third party. If you here at DFID could just collude with the boss so as to jointly underreport your income, so that everything looks consistent from the perspective of HMRC, well, then there's no smoking gun for evasion, and then it doesn't work. So you need to have that there's no collusion, and of course, there is no collusion at DFID. There is no collusion at LSE. There's no way we would ever do that. And the question is, what kind of firm structure and what is it about firms that make third-party reporting works in some countries and not other countries? So when we think about information reporting in developing countries, we have to think about a lot of factors. We have to think about industrial compensation. We have to think about firm size and firm complexity, the financial sector, and so on. So these are the kinds of things that we're thinking about in the ITC. So we have a number. I've listed here some of the examples, and it's just a subset, but some of the examples of some of the recent projects in the ITC that looks at tax enforcement and are trying to study some of these factors here. So for example, one specific question which is important is this thing about evasion substitution. A problem that we face in developing countries is that if you start out from a situation where a very small fraction of income is actually third-party reported, and then you expand third-party reporting, there's all this other income which is not third-party reported, and individuals and firms and so on, agents can engage in evasion substitution where they just, okay, there's more third-party reporting here, so I can't evade here, so I'm just going to move my income over here, in which case, of course, you're not going to be successful. So this is sort of one example of the question that we're looking at. Okay, so I'm going to move on from this, so tax enforcement to tax policy. But again, the key, so in general, when we think about taxation in developing countries, we're thinking very much about tax compliance. So in some sense, all of these topics that I'm talking about, I'm thinking about them very much in terms of tax compliance, which is one of the key questions. Okay, so we have a very long and rich literature on tax policy in the academic literature. But that literature has been focused almost exclusively on high-income countries, both in terms of the models that were developed and the empirical evidence. But we have some classic recommendations from the tax theory literature, and in a nutshell, it says the following. It says it's a good thing to use progressive income taxes and value-added taxes. Those are great policies. Those are the ones you should use. And it's very bad to use policies such as differentiated consumption taxes, capital taxes, on trade and intermediate goods. Those are sort of, it's a little bit simplified, but that's sort of, in a nutshell what the traditional literature is saying. Now that sounds great. I mean, these are some great conclusions to have if they're universally true. But the problem is that based on some models that make assumptions, and particularly make two assumptions that are very bad assumptions for what we're interested in here. They assume that tax enforcement is perfect, which means that there is zero evasion and zero administrative cost. And the other assumption is they assume that policymakers have at their disposal a full set of tax instruments. For example, they have a fully flexible personal income tax that can be imposed on all individuals in the country. Again, an assumption which is not satisfied in development countries. So what we want to do in the IGC is to relax those assumptions and then see what happens. So I think basically what we want to do is a lot of the literature, a lot of the academic literature has really been focusing on tax rates. And where we want to move is we want to move from tax rates to tax instruments. So for example, in the academic literature, there's a massive amount of work that takes the tax policy instrument as given, and one tax policy instrument that people have often looked at is the personal income tax. And then there's all sorts of fancy stuff to find out what are the optimal tax rates in the personal income tax. You know, how exactly do we want to design the progressive income tax schedule in a country like the UK? That's a pretty interesting question for the UK, but it's completely second order for the typical IGC country, because there personal income tax is just very hard to implement, and so you have it's not a very important tax policy instrument. Very few people pay it. So we should look at a completely different question, which is more what instruments can we implement successfully in a country like that? And specifically, how I want to pose it is. Whereas the traditional literature was all about how do you design policies to get the best possible trade-off between efficiency on the one hand and equity or redistribution on the other hand. Whereas what we want to look at here is really what instrument represent the best trade-off between, on the one hand, the efficiency equity stuff that people have been thinking about, and on the other hand, compliance and administration concerns that are just absolutely central in developing countries. So example, one paper that looks at this is a paper that I did with co-authors, with Michael Best and Brockmeyer, Spinline and Massawa Wassim recently, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that paper as an example. But before doing that, just to sort of give you a sense of empirically how important it is to turn from tax rates to tax instruments, I'm going to go back and show you some graphs. And first, let me go back to the graph, which was my very first slide. So we've already seen this one. Okay, so there's positive correlation between tax take and GDP per capita. But it's actually interesting to decompose this graph into what is happening along the development path with different kinds of tax instruments. And specifically, let's divide instruments into two categories. Instruments that basically rely on third-party information. I'm going to call those modern taxes. Examples would be the personal income tax, value-added tax, payroll taxes, social security contributions. And on the other hand, what I'm going to call traditional taxes, which are taxes that typically rely on purely self-reported information. And that would be property taxes, inheritance taxes, custom duties, excises, sales taxes, and so on. And when we do this split, when we do a graph like this where we split into these two instruments, you see something interesting, namely that the entire positive correlation that you're looking at in the previous graph is driven by modern taxes, that is third-party reported taxes. Whereas when you look at traditional taxes, it's completely flat. There is no correlation across countries. In other words, what's happening over the development path is that something is happening with third-party reported taxes, not with property taxes or inheritance taxes. So that's one way of looking at, where you're looking at the cross-sectional variation across countries at a point in time. Another thing you can look at, which is informative, I think, is to look within countries over the long run of history, and specifically to look at countries that are now developed countries, but that a long time ago were developing countries. So here I've shown 4 specific countries: the United States, France, Germany, and Denmark. And we've done a long time series like this for a much larger set of countries, but whatever country you look at, you get the same picture and it looks exactly like this. So what are we looking at here? We're again looking at the tax take and how that evolves over a long time, typically between 100 and 150 years in these 4 different countries. And then we decompose what's happening to the tax take into the modern taxes that are third-party reported and the traditional taxes that are not. And a couple of interesting conclusions come out from this. First of all, in all countries, you're basically looking at an S-shaped evolution of the tax take. It was flat, and then there was a period of expansion between the early 20th century until around 1970, and then it's flat again. So that has S-shape you see in all countries. And the second interesting thing is that all of that S-shape, all of that expansion was driven by third-party reported taxes and not at all by traditional taxes. In some countries, you see some specific spikes at certain points. So, for example, here in the US, you see a spike around World War II. You see the same in the UK. So sometimes there are some spikes around wars. So wars can play some short-term role in compelling countries to expand their tax capacity. But independently of exposure to wars, and independently of that specific timing, the long-run stylized pattern is the same in all countries. They have the same shape, and it's driven by third-party reports. I have another 20 minutes left. Okay, that's pretty good. So, of course, one of the things that you get from this picture is that it has taken a long time to get from here to there in these countries, and there is a reason why it took a long time, which means that there is no sort of very easy solution to expanding tax take in developing countries, because there was a reason why it took time. There were a lot of things that were changing along the way here that was part of what was driving this. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be completely defeated and say, oh, there's nothing we can do, we just have to wait for these countries to develop. I mean, we want to do, that's where we want to look for the incremental improvements, but it's just to say that, there are a lot of factors that go into this process, and some of those factors are changing slowly, and that's a constraint on this whole problem. Okay. So with that general, so this is sort of the big picture macro view on things. So now let me move from macro to micro, which is what we want to do with the IGC. So, and go back to the specific paper that I was involved in that I just mentioned. So here's a very important and classic result in the theory of public finance. It goes back to Peter Diamond and Jim Earley's in 1971. It's called the production efficient theorem. What this theorem tells us is that assuming perfect enforcement, only production efficient tax instruments should be used. It's an incredibly powerful policy conclusion and a very strong theorem, because it rules in some things and it rules out a lot of other things. What this does is that it rules in taxes on income, wages, and profits. At the same time, it rules out taxes on turnover, trade, and intermediate inputs. Now, this theorem has been incredibly influential, including in the World Bank and in the IMF, where, it's been underlying a lot of the policy advice given to developing countries over the past several decades. But the problem is, of course, it assumes perfect enforcement. Now, in actual developed countries, we do see a lot of production inefficient tax policy, and the question is really, should we tell them to abolish those policies and implement policies that are production efficient, or should we look at the specific context and see whether there might be a reason for having those specific production inefficient tax policies in those settings? So here's a specific production inefficient tax policy that you see in numerous countries. It's a minimum tax scheme.
Henrik, can I just ask you?
Yeah.
Can you actually give us a sense of what production efficient tax instruments would be? Give a few examples.
Yeah, so a production efficient tax is a personal income tax. A personal income tax, it distorts labor leisure choices for individuals. It might affect consumption, but it's not going to affect production input mix. So that's a production efficient tax. A production inefficient tax is a tax on, for example, intermediate inputs, which is going to distort production decisions between labor and those inputs. Okay. Another specific production inefficient tax, which is the one we look at in this paper, is a tax on turnover. The simplest way to realize why a turnover tax is production inefficient is just to realize that part of what a turnover tax is that it's a tax on intermediate inputs, because some turnover reflects sales to other firms that are using these inputs. So when you tax turnover, you're going to distort input decisions in firms. The thing is, a lot of developing countries have turnover taxes. The form in which they often have it is these minimum tax schemes, whereby firms are taxed either on profits or on turnover. So you basically, the firm reports their turnover, they report their profits, you apply two different tax rates to the two bases, and then you ask which tax liability is larger, and you pay the one which is larger. Effectively, basically, if your profit tax liability falls too low, below some threshold, you're not going to be taxed on your profits, you're going to be taxed on your turnover instead. That's a production inefficient policy, but it's motivated by the idea, which is an open question that hasn't been tested yet, but it's been motivated by the idea that turnover taxes might be harder to evade than profit taxes. It's an intuitive idea, in part because turnover taxes falls on a much, much broader base, and typically we tend to think that it's harder to evade on a broader base. And also that it shuts down one evasion channel, which is namely over-declaring costs. Right? In a profit tax, you can evade by over-declaring costs. you can't do that in cost and out-of-pocket tax rates. Yeah.
Are you conflating tax evasion and tax avoidance? So, for example, firms could legally be declaring certain things, shifting profits abroad, for example.
That's right. In general, in practice, I probably am. I think what we're capturing is, but in general, the distinction between evasion and avoidance is, first of all, it's difficult conceptually because there's a big gray area. So that's one. It's also empirically difficult to distinguish between the two because the decision-making process that goes into the two have to be quite similar. So in practice, I think we're kind of conflating evasion and avoidance here in this project, as one often.
Can I ask
is.
another question as well?
Yeah.
Just kind, I guess, slight parallel. Would this principle go for developed countries as well, with kind of internet companies, for example, not be shifting profits overseas?
Yeah.
Would there be a similar rationale for the UK maybe to have a minimum tax scheme on turnover?
Yeah, potentially there would. Ultimately, and this is one of the things we showed. Ultimately, the argument for doing it depends on how much evasion and avoidance is there. So if you have a system with a lot of evasion and avoidance, this kind of system can create much lower evasion and avoidance. And if those evasion reductions are large enough, they might outweigh the loss of production efficiency. But other things equal, they sound like a more compelling idea for developing countries because we think evasion and avoidance is logic. And that's what we show this paper. So basically, what we do in this paper is to come up with a way in which to estimate evasion responses to a shift between a profit tax and a turnover tax. And what we argue in the paper is, or what the estimate we come up with is that turnover tax is actually able to reduce evasion by up to 60 to 70% of corporate income. So an enormous reduction in evasion. And we then link that with a model to show that these compliance gains potentially outweigh the loss of production efficiency, making this a good policy in that specific setting. So just give you a flavor of how the kind of research that we do in IGC, and in this paper specifically, let me show you this graph. So what this graph is showing, so what we use here, we use administrative tax records that we got access to through our collaboration with the Federal Board of Revenue in Pakistan. And so we use administrative tax records for the full population of tax-registered firms in Pakistan. And then we basically plot here the distribution of profit rates. So how many firms are there at different levels of the profit rates in Pakistan? Now, very briefly, in Pakistan, you have two sets of firms. Some firms are facing a high profit tax rate, and other firms are facing a lower profit tax rate. And for these two sets of firms, the minimum tax scheme works slightly differently. In particular, what happens, so what the minimum tax scheme effectively doing is for both sets of firms is that it creates a cutoff in the profit rate distribution where you switch from a profit tax to a turnover tax. So for the blue guys, those are the high profit tax rate firms, specifically at a profit rate of 1.43%. Specifically that level, when your profit rate crosses this way, you go from a profit tax to a turnover tax. For the low rate firms, that threshold happens at 2.5%. Now what you can see in this graph is that something is going on with those cutoffs because you have very sharp, what we call excess bunching, precisely at those profit rate thresholds for each set of firms, exactly at the threshold that set of firms is facing. So what that means in very general terms is that firms are responding to this minimum tax scheme in some way. And then in some sense what we spend a lot of our efforts in that paper to do is to find out exactly what does this response mean. And what we do is to link this evidence with a theoretical framework to make the case that all of this is evasion or avoidance and not real responses. And it has to do with how this, I'm not going to go into details with that because that will basically make me sort of present the whole paper, and we don't have time for that. But basically we make that case that this is evasion and avoidance, and that's how we get to the 60 to 70% number, using this bunching combined with a model. And then we show, again linking to the model, that actually might be welfare improving, even though these things are less production efficient. So I think this project is an example of a project that combines essentially all of the elements that are listed in the nitty-gritty micro approach in the beginning. So we have great data, administrative tax records. We have exogenous variation in tax policy, and here the exogenous variation comes from the fact that there is a discontinuity in incentives at a specific place. That's the variation we use. We have a link between evidence and models, which I think is one of the great strengths of the taxation field. And finally, we have a close collaboration with policymakers, because we couldn't have done this if the Federal Board of Revenue hadn't given us access. So it kind of combines all the features. Is there a question? Is there a question? No? Okay. So again, what is the research agenda here? Again, the default recommendation for us is not to say, oh, you should just replicate policies, tax policies from high-income countries. I actually think that's what, to a large extent, the IMF has been doing for many years. They've just said, I don't know, the VAT and personal income tax is great because it's great in Europe and in the US, so you should do that. That's not the approach we take. We consider the specific context, and sometimes the conclusion is that the existing policy is exactly right. Sometimes the conclusion is that the existing policy is bad, and I think both conclusions are very useful. And just to give you an example of each of these, so the paper I just described is one that says, well, they're actually doing something in Pakistan, which is what we would not normally recommend for developed countries, but it's actually working in a specific context, so that's a good thing. On the other hand, I had another paper with Masar Wasim that looked at the personal income tax in Pakistan, and which was a paper that showed that the way they designed the personal income tax was terrible and very inefficient, and we're actually very proud of the policy impact of that paper, because that paper actually led to a big federal income tax reform in Pakistan, where they basically followed exactly the recommendations from our paper. So that's probably the biggest policy impact that I've ever had. A national tax reform in a country with 160 million. So we're happy about that. But we have both these sides here. Okay. The next one that I wanted to talk a little. Yeah.
I want to be conscious. We're close to 1 o'clock. Lots of people start leaving.
I see.
So you have
okay.
about
so
7 minutes before that moment happens.
I have about 7 minutes. All right. Okay.
We have the room for a little bit longer for those who want to ask questions. But
right. Okay. I might not get to the end of my slides, but I'll just let me try and do the tax morale one pretty quickly. So this is something we're also interested in. I think this is something we just know much less about, not just for developing countries, but also for developing countries. That is, to what extent are people complying with taxes because of, broadly speaking, non-pecuniary factors? That is, going back to our discussion at the beginning, just because, say, they're good people, they think it's the right thing to do. And that might be pretty important for a tax system as well, and it's something we want to study. In general, I think we have 4 different types of tax morale we might want to think about. One is what I've called intrinsic motivation here. That's like, I'm a good person, or I think it's the moral thing to do. One is social norms. That is, I comply with taxes because everybody else around me seems to be complying with taxes, so that's the right thing to do because of that. One is reciprocity, which I think would be quite important here for IGC countries, which is that I comply with taxes if I think the government is doing a good job. If I think they are corrupt and implementing bad policies, then I'm not going to do it. And finally, you have sort of long-run cultural aspects that are a lot harder to study. So I think there are 2 kinds of questions we want to ask here. One is we want to try and quantify the importance of these tax morale mechanisms, and the second one, probably more important one, is can policymakers affect tax morale? Policymakers can affect this. In some sense, we don't. Well, it's kind of intellectually stimulating, but it's not really important for us because we're trying to change things. So, and for the second one, I think there are 2 types of policy questions. One is the interaction between tax morale and standard policy measures. So when we implement tax policy, for example, are there certain types of tax policy that are better received and give rise to larger tax morale than other tax instruments, right? So a classic example is the Thatcher poll tax in the 80s as a policy which probably totally backfired in terms of tax morale and created very low compliance in the council tax for a few years. So standard tax policies, if they're not, they don't get widespread support, can be bad for tax morale. And another one is the effect of non-standard policy instruments that are specifically aimed at providing what we call social incentives. So, for example, providing social recognition for complying with taxes, shaming policies, and so on. And we have a couple of projects on that, and I think Jonathan was mentioning, someone was mentioning one of them in the beginning, which is the paper with Raj Chetty and Mushfiq Mubarak and Monica Singhal, looking at the effects of basically providing social recognition for tax compliance in Bangladesh, and then they're working closely with the Federal Board of Revenue, or I think it's called the National Board of Revenue in Bangladesh. And we have other projects on that agenda. Okay, so the final one, and now I'm going a little bit quickly, is tax administration. So this is something, again, like tax morale, it's been very underexplored in the tax field academically. It's something that people have thought a lot more about in the context of the provision of public services. So, for example, health workers, teachers, and so on. There, people have talked a lot about administration and incentives for public bureaucrats. But in taxation, we haven't thought a lot about it, and that's a big gap in the literature. So one potential problem is that besides evasion, there might also be a lot of corruption. And one of the reasons why there might be a lot of corruption is that there are very bad incentives for tax inspectors. And that's because their pay is generally untied to performance, and because the career advancement opportunities are potentially